Hi there. Let's take a look at every place the US has bombed. Well, almost every place. For all their talk about human rights, freedom, and democracy, the true colors of the US come out in their aerial bombardment campaigns, which are surprisingly carried out only to suit the interests of capital and foreign policy beneficial to it. Let's start. During the Vietnam War from 1965 to 1973, the United States engaged in a cruel and unnecessary bombing campaign in Cambodia. These terror bombings were justified by claiming to be aimed at disrupting North Vietnamese supply routes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a logistical line used by the Vietnamese people to resist American aggression. The impact of these operations stretched far beyond military objectives, ravaging civilian populations and contributing to widespread misery. The volume of bombs dropped over Cambodia was extraordinary. From the start of Operation Breakfast in March of 1969 to its conclusion in May 1970, a total of 539,000 tons of bombs were deployed. Notably, nearly half of this amount, 257,000 tons, was dropped in the last 6 months of the campaign, from February to August 1973, surpassing the 160,000 tons dropped on Japan throughout World War II. B-52 bombers were flying daily, at peak 81 sorties over Cambodia, which was higher than the maximum daily sorties over Vietnam. One notable incident that illustrates the lack of care about the human cost of these bombings occurred on August 7, 1973, when a B-52 strike mistakenly hit the Cambodian town of Nha Long due to a navigation error, killing 137 people and wounding 268. The total number of people killed directly or indirectly by these bombings is difficult to quantify, but is estimated to be between 50 and 150,000. The intensive bombing campaigns in Cambodia led to widespread displacement, forcing many to flee their homes and sparking a major refugee crisis that disrupted social and economic structures. The bombings absolutely devastated crucial infrastructure such as agricultural markets, water resources, severely damaging the economy and escalating poverty among survivors. In 1954, there was a coup in Guatemala characterized by extensive military and logistical support given to rebel forces by the CIA in their efforts to topple the democratically elected president Jacobo Arbenz. Arms embargoes 6 years before the invasion of the United States had already significantly reduced Guatemala's ability for self-defense against US-supported insurgencies. The rebels were supplied with P-47 fighter planes, critical in conducting strafing and bombing missions against major targets across Guatemala. These airplanes bombed a number of points, including the National Palace and a school, with rounds of 50 caliber machine gun ammunition and 5-pound fragmentation bombs. Starting in May 1954, the CIA began bombing Guatemala, focusing on military installations and strategic infrastructure. Then, on June 18, significant bombing aimed at disabling the Guatemalan military also resulted in significant damage to civilian areas. Additionally, the CIA conducted a psychological warfare campaign, dropping leaflets over Guatemala City and military sites to sow fear and confusion amongst both the military and civilian population. Parallel with military operations, the US undertook an organized disinformation campaign to shape international and local opinion on the character of the conflict. The US ambassador to Guatemala was an active player, dismissing the actual levels of the attacks to international observers and even denying American involvement. The State Department categorically denied any role for the United States in a conflict, framing it instead as a domestic uprising rather than an externally, CIA, orchestrated coup. The psychological impact of bombing and the presence of foreign aircraft overhead resulted in widespread fear among civilians, forcing many to flee their homes to escape potential danger zones. This resulted in internal displacement and chaos within communities. Concurrently, the bombing disrupted daily life and economic activities. Damage to key infrastructure and the constant threat of attacks led to a breakdown in normal life, with civilians struggling to access basic services and maintain their livelihoods. I have a video on the DPRK here, if you're interested. During the Korean War in the early 50s, the US Air Force executed one of the most intense and immoral bombing campaigns in history, which targeted North Korean civilian and military infrastructure, trade routes, and logistical support from DPRK allies and large population centers. The extent and ferocity of the bombing was unprecedented, with the US dropping approximately 635,000 tons of bombs, including 32,000 tons of napalm. This massive aerial bombardment far exceeded the tonnage dropped during World War II in the Pacific Theater. Major cities, including Pyongyang, faced severe devastation, with Pyongyang being over 75% destroyed. The city was so devastated that American bombing was halted as, and I quote, there was no longer any worthy targets. By the end of the US bombing campaign, US bombers had difficulty finding anything left to even bomb, either returning to base with their munitions still attached or by releasing their bombs into the sea instead. Other urban areas like Hamhung, Hungnam, and Sinanju experienced similar levels of destruction, with estimates of 80 to 95% destruction in some cities. The bombing campaign destroyed almost every substantial building in North Korea. US Major General William F. Dean stated that the majority of North Korean cities and villages he saw were either rubble or snow-covered wasteland. Dean Rusk, the US State Department official who headed East Asian affairs, said that America had bombed everything that moved in North Korea, every brick standing on top of another. Practically all of society that still lived was forced to exist underground to avoid being bombed, including factories, schools, hospitals, and government offices. The indiscriminate nature of these bombing campaigns, designed to demoralize the North Korean populace and disintegrate societal structures, led to loss of life in the millions, over 20% of the Korean population at the time. Three days after the 9/11 attacks, US Congress authorized a military response targeting Afghanistan. This led to the fall of the Taliban in November 2001. By April of 2002, there were 7,000 US troops in the country, as many had returned home, with Bush giving a speech at the Virginia Military Institute that same month exposing his true vision for Afghanistan, which shifted from so-called counterterrorism to nation-building and social engineering. US officials like Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld were very concerned about the lack of a clear exit strategy and potential for a prolonged catastrophe like in Vietnam. In November 2001, the US began bombing campaigns in Kunduz to target Taliban forces, including foreign fighters, aiming to dismantle their military capabilities but causing considerable destruction in the process. The following month, the focus shifted to Tora Bora, where extensive airstrikes were carried out on suspected hideouts of Osama bin Laden and his followers, leading to destruction of numerous caves and bunkers. Throughout this war, Helmand Province, a known Taliban stronghold and opium production center, also endured repeated airstrikes that not only targeted drug labs and Taliban hideouts, but also caused widespread damage to infrastructure. The Pentagon, which engaged in gross mismanagement of funds, including an unaccounted for and non-existent $8 million industrial park, threw away at least $1 trillion on the entire venture. We can't really know how many bombs were dropped, but to give you a sense, here are some of the numbers during Operation Enduring Freedom. In the first 76 days, from October 7 to December 23, 2001, the US flew about 6,500 strike missions over Afghanistan. The US dropped or fired over 10,000 bombs or missiles on Afghanistan by November 20, 2001. By December 10th, this would increase to 12,000. Through March 2002, the US had dropped around to 20,000 bombs. Operation Anaconda, launched on March 1, 2002, saw over 350 bombs and missiles dropped on targets during the first 4 days of fighting, with nearly 3,500 bombs dropped by the end of the continuous operation in late March. By the end of November 2001, the Air Force had flown more than 600 sorties. About 4,700 tons of munitions were dropped by just B-1 and B-52 bombers. Misguided or misidentified strikes, which happened often, contributed to significant civilian loss, escalating insecurity and terror. Beyond immediate human costs, airstrikes often damaged or destroyed homes, schools, healthcare facilities, and crucial water infrastructure. This extensive destruction displaced communities and drastically reduced access to essential services, exacerbating humanitarian crises. The constant threat of airstrikes created a pervasive atmosphere of fear and trauma, particularly impacting the psychological well-being of civilians, most especially children. Many families fled their homes, becoming internally displaced persons facing dire conditions. Moreover, the destruction of infrastructure and agricultural land disrupted local economies, particularly in rural areas where many families lost their livelihoods, further intensifying poverty and food insecurity across the region. Back to the video in just a second. Let's hear from today's sponsor. It's happened that I've found myself lost abroad or in need of an internet connection with no Wi-Fi spot in sight, and without a local SIM card that would make all the difference. That's where Saily comes in. What is Saily? Well, it's an eSIM provider which provides an internet connection wherever you travel and saves you money on roaming fees. Saily lets you choose several affordable eSIM plans in over 150 countries. With a Saily eSIM, you'll always have a connection when needed. With Saily, an eSIM needs to be installed only once, eliminating the need for users to install a new eSIM for each country. You don't need to wait in line at the airport to get a local SIM card, can avoid scammers selling fake SIM cards outside train stations and airports, and significantly reduce and even eliminate roaming fees. No more wandering around looking for a public Wi-Fi spot. With an eSIM, you're always connected. What's more is that all Saily eSIM plans are compatible for iOS or Android devices with 24/7 support available and a full refund if your device isn't eSIM compatible. So what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description and get started. Anyone can get a Saily eSIM plan on the Saily website or through its app. Just buy a plan, with several offers available for over 150 countries at some of the best rates you'll find. Download the Saily app, install the eSIM, and activate your plan. If you activate your eSIM before you leave your country, you'll be able to easily connect to local networks when you land and without the need for an internet connection. Don't wait, use my dedicated link in the description box, saily.com/Hakeem, to check out Saily and purchase an eSIM plan. Thanks to Saily for the sponsorship. This allows me to pay my editor fairly, which is very appreciated. Alright, back to the video. The NATO bombing campaign against Yugoslavia in 1999, known as Operation Allied Force, only lasted 78 days, from March 24th to June 10th, 1999. The justification given by NATO was to halt and reverse human rights abuses against Kosovo seeking independence from Serbia, and the brutal crackdown by Serbian forces under Slobodan Milosevic. The air campaign involved nearly all NATO member states at the time, conducting more than 1,000 sorties with fighter jets, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft. On April 12, 1999, NATO missiles struck a passenger train on a bridge near Gredlice, causing civilian casualties in what's marked as a severe misjudgment of the campaign. Weeks later, on May 1st, a NATO bomb hit a bridge in Ljubljana just as a bus was crossing, resulting in significant civilian loss. Then on May 7th, an attack with cluster bombs on a market in Niš led to more civilian deaths and injuries, underscoring the harsh realities of the conflict. Spending $3 billion on approximately 28,000 high-explosive munitions, the exact number and types of bombs used remain classified. But NATO primarily used so-called precision-guided weapons, despite which the use of didn't prevent several civilian targets being hit, as well as the Chinese embassy being struck. Estimated civilian deaths from NATO airstrikes range from 488 to 527. I've already done a video about the US war on my country, which you should watch after this video here. However, given its scope and impact, it's important to include a summary. Iraq was illegally invaded by the US in 2003 on dubious pretext of having WMDs, using wildly disproportionate violence. Aside from the lack of WMDs found, the main public objective was the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, while the reality was the penetration of Iraqi markets by Western capital, the privatization of Iraqi oil and other natural resources, and the dismantling of Iraq's ability to threaten the existence of Israel. The war resulted in numerous bloodbaths, millions of people being displaced, and an extensive number of dead and injured. Estimates are difficult to nail down, but the direct military conflict resulted in over 500,000 dead, and the reverberations of the war pushed that number easily into the millions. Infrastructure and cultural sites intrinsic to humanity were severely damaged, including unique historical artifacts, aside from the ones that all the Americans stole. Oil production, the backbone of the economy, fell from 2.5 million barrels daily before the war to around 2 million by the end of 2003. The fiscal implications of the war left a significant imprint on the US economy. The cost of it, which included all the wasteful spending by the Pentagon, put the figure near $14 trillion. The US brought an overwhelming amount of force to bear on Iraq, and here are just some of the stats on screen. This is of course not mentioning the American use of depleted uranium munitions, which to this day result in pediatric cancers and child malformations. US bombings have left deep marks on civilian life, causing direct casualties, destroying infrastructure, and sparking ongoing health problems due to environmental contamination. These strikes frequently demolished homes, schools, and hospitals, severely disrupting everyday activities and access to crucial services. Like every other place mentioned already, the bombing triggered widespread displacement, with millions forced to leave their homes, which of course adds to local and regional turmoil. The environmental impact is often profound, contaminating water sources and farmland, effects that can linger on for decades. The perfect example is that leukemia rates have skyrocketed following the US invasion and bombing of my country, of course, as a result of the aforementioned depleted uranium munitions. The US bombing campaign in Laos from 1964 to 1973 during the Vietnam War was likewise aimed at cutting off North Vietnamese supply routes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Beginning in April 1964, the US Air Force trained pilots in Laos and Thailand. Operation Barrel Roll in December 1964 signaled the start of the war in northern Laos and was followed by Operation Steel Tiger in early 1965. In one harrowing incident, bombs were mistakenly dropped on a friendly village just after a visit by Ambassador Sullivan, resulting in significant civilian casualties. This was part of a broader pattern where numerous smaller villages in strategic areas along the trail and beyond were targeted and destroyed, leading to high civilian casualties and the displacement of rural populations who depended on the land for their livelihoods. The bombing also heavily damaged critical infrastructure, schools, hospitals, local marketplaces, disrupting daily life and causing long-term socioeconomic challenges. I sound like a broken record at this point. The strikes often weren't just collateral damage, a horrible word to use regardless. In many cases, they targeted facilities believed to be used by enemy combatants, adding to the so-called complexity of the war's impact on civilians. The environmental impact was also severe, significantly altering the landscape and affecting agriculture, which in turn led to long-term economic hardships for the survivors. These sustained bombings deeply affected the social fabric and health of the Laotian people, leaving scars that persist decades later. The bombing of Laos was unprecedented in scale. Over 2 billion kilograms of bombs dropped, over 1,000 per inhabitant, consisted of over 580,000 bombing missions, equating to a raid every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 years. Additionally, to further illustrate the massive amount of munitions used, of all the bombs dropped, approximately 270 million were specifically cluster bombs, which released so-called sub-munitions, with about 30% failing to explode on impact. As of writing, Laos is the world's most heavily bombed country per capita. However, this could be soon eclipsed by the actions of the illegal settler colonial nation in Palestine. In addition to the nightmarish immediate effects of the bombing, the cost of the bombing was also substantial, with daily expenditures reaching about $17 million in 1962, which is around $176 million today. In addition to the numerous civilian casualties during the operation, unexploded ordnance have continued to take lives long after the cessation of hostilities. US involvement in Nicaragua began in the early 20th century with military occupations and intervention aimed at protecting American interests and installing friendly governments. One of the most notable early interventions occurred in 1927 during the rebellion led by Augusto Sandino, a prominent figure in Nicaraguan history who opposed US influence in Central America. The US Marines' engagement in the Battle of Ocotal marked a significant use of air power, notably being one of the first instances of aerial bombardment in the Western Hemisphere. The battle saw US aircraft deployed in a tactical role to support ground troops, resulting in substantial casualties among Nicaraguan rebels and civilians, setting a precedent for future US military tactics in the region. The most intense period of US involvement came during the 80s under Reagan, which viewed the Sandinista government that came to power in 1979 as a Soviet ally in the Western Hemisphere. In the 1980s, the US was deeply involved in covert and overt operations in Nicaragua, significantly impacting civilian life. In 1984, a covert operation to mine Nicaraguan ports like Corinto not only damaged commercial ships, but also blocked civilian access to essential goods and fuel, exacerbating economic and social difficulties. During that same decade, US-backed Contras frequently bombed rural areas, targeting small farms and villages, disrupting local agriculture, causing civilian casualties and driving many into internal displacement. Additionally, Contras forces carried out border raids from Honduras, using US-supplied helicopters and logistics to attack inside Nicaragua, affecting both military and civilian targets, which led to further loss of life and property destruction. The support was part of a US strategy to contain communism, but was executed in ways that often bypassed congressional restrictions, culminating in the Iran-Contra affair, which I covered in my earlier Iran video. US actions in Nicaragua were met with significant criticism, and the International Court of Justice ruled in 1986 that the US had violated international law by funding the Contras. The US sponsored and stoked conflict affected 50,000 people, over 20,000 of which were deaths. Widespread damage to infrastructure and agriculture intensified economic deprivation and forced a mass displacement of around 250,000 people, deeply impacting social stability and increasing dependence on international aid. In August 1998, the US conducted airstrikes in Sudan as part of its global counterterrorism strategy, before the so-called War on Terror. The primary target of the airstrikes was the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical plant in Khartoum, which produced over half of all medicine for Sudan. The US justified the attack under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, citing the right to self-defense. How a Sudanese medical factory could harm the US is explained through the ridiculous claim that Sudan was producing VX nerve gas precursors at the facility, supposedly linked to Osama bin Laden's terror network. This intelligence was later questioned, and there is zero evidence to substantiate American claims. On August 20, 1998, the United States launched 75 cruise missiles targeting the Al-Shifa plant in Sudan and various training facilities in Afghanistan. Each cruise missile cost between $750,000 and $1 million, and nearly $750 million worth in weapons were fired in the strikes overall. The immediate damage and casualties in Sudan were not clearly known, but easily climbs into many tens of thousands because of the immediate destruction of over half of the medical production capabilities of the African country. That's aside from the hundreds of people who work in the plant. Sudan invited the US to conduct chemical tests at the site for evidence to support its claim that the plant may have been a chemical weapons factory. The US refused the invitation to investigate and never officially apologized for the attacks. The US would subsequently block the Security Council from conducting a fact-finding mission to validate the claims about the chemical weapons production at Al-Shifa. A common view of the American public at the time was that the strike was intended to distract media attention from Clinton's Lewinsky scandal.
My fellow Americans, I would once again like to say that I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
It's the same reason he bombed Iraq around the same time. The involvement of the United States in Vietnam spanned from an advisory role in the 1950s to eventually a full-scale invasion that ended by 1975. The primary aim was to prevent the spread of communism, as always, in Southeast Asia, supporting the puppet dictatorship in South Vietnam against the popular communist movement that had until then been pushed into North Vietnam. The US Air Force executed possibly the most intensive bombing campaign in military history during the Vietnam War. Notably, operations such as Rolling Thunder, Linebacker 1 and 2 involved massive aerial bombardments intended to cripple North Vietnam's capacity to sustain its military forces and support the Viet Cong in the south. On March 17, 1965, an airstrike targeting hostile fire in Man Quang village killed 45 people, including 37 schoolchildren. 2 years later, on March 2, 1967, bombs ravaged the village of Lang Vei in Quang Tri province, a region hardly spared from bombings, leaving at least 100 civilians dead and another 175 injured. Additionally, in the An Lao Valley, over half the village huts were destroyed and rice fields were devastated by bomb craters, leaving the villagers in severe hardship, a grim snapshot of the war's brutal impact on civilian areas. Over the course of all of these and other operations, the US dropped approximately 640,000 tons of bombs, targeting transportation lines, industrial bases, civilian centers, and air defenses. US military strategy in Vietnam included the use of chemical weapons, specifically Agent Orange and defoliants. These chemicals are sprayed over rural landscapes and dense forests to deny cover to enemy forces and to destroy crops that may support them. Over 19 million gallons of defoliants were used, approximately affecting 4.5 million acres of land. The long-term health effects and environmental damage from these chemicals have left a lasting legacy of suffering and ecological disruption in Vietnam. The air campaign and ground operations led to significant civilian casualties and displacement. Estimates of civilian deaths vary widely, with numbers ranging from 65,000 to more than 180,000 directly attributed to aerial bombings alone. The total casualties of the war exceeded 2 million. The destruction of villages, infrastructure, and the displacement of millions of people contributed to a profound humanitarian crisis during and after the conflict, in which the US would begin economically embargoing Vietnam to prevent their reorganization following their heroic defeat of American forces. The United States has a long history of involvement with Cuba, including the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Additionally, the United States has maintained economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure on Cuba in an attempt to isolate and overthrow the legitimate government of Cuba. I made a dedicated video on Cuba you can see here. This is only a cursory glance at the many crimes of the United States, intended to maintain the foreign policy interests of an American ruling class completely disconnected from regular American people, working against their interests for profit no matter the human or environmental cost. A better system is possible. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon, it really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Nitro Dubs, Kenny, Thomas Roberts, Nicholas, Owen Baker, T. Wood, Dr. Lemonman, Lumix, Charlie and Eric, Ultimate Turin, Daniel Ethel, The Generic Guy, Santiago Pereira, Rain, Cassandra Corvus, David Fries, Confuse M, Mariana Mastusovic, Robbie Richardson, and Masay Kadro. Thanks for watching.